Hello, and welcome to another presentation in the Coder Web Training Series, providing instruction in the manual application of the ICD-10 International Rules and Guidelines for Mortality Classification. This presentation examines the special instructions for applying steps M2 and M3. My name is Patricia Wood, and I'll be your guide through this presentation. Along with Drs. Saman Gamaj and Yusuf Hamid, I work as an ICD-10 consultant for the CDC Foundation, who sponsors this Coder Web Training project. This presentation and others in this series are based on the WHO Mortality Classification Rules and Guidelines found in ICD-10 Volume 2. These rules and guidelines have been the subject of numerous updates over the years, and we use the 2016 version, which is the most recent readily available one. If you don't already have a copy of the 2016 version of Volume 2, you can find one at the link on this slide. We use this slide in each presentation in the Coder Web Training Series as a reminder of the ICD-10 mortality coding process. First, the mortality classification rules and guidelines in ICD-10 Volume 2 are meant to be applied to cause of death information reported on the standard International Medical Certificate of Cause of Death as recommended by the World Health Organization. Next, in order to apply the rules properly, an ICD-10 code number should be applied to each cause of death reported. Basic coding guidelines can be found in Volume 2. And finally, the mortality classification rules and guidelines found in Chapter 4 of ICD-10 Volume 2 are applied to the coded information on the death certificate. The next few slides present a short review of the information available in Volume 2. After coding all causes of death reported, the first step in choosing an underlying cause of death for statistical presentation is to select the tentative starting point. This is done by applying selection steps SP1 through SP8 as per the rules and guidelines found in Volume 2, Section 4.1 to 4.2.1. This material is covered in other presentations in this series, so if you need a refresher of it, please have a look at other videos on this channel. Once the tentative starting point has been selected, the next step is to check whether it is subject to modification by any other information on the certificate. The special instructions for applying the modification steps, step M1 through M4, are found in Volume 2 in sections 4.2.2 and 4.2.5 through 4.2.9. On this slide is a reminder of the modification part of the process of selecting an underlying cause of death. As you can read on the slide from Volume 2, selecting the underlying cause of death involves two separate steps. First, identify the starting point. Next, check whether any special instructions apply to the starting point. If so, the next step is to modify the starting point identified during the selection step. Selection leads to modification, which leads to an underlying cause of death being selected. So, what is modification? In ICD-10 Volume 2, as a basic concept, modification is special coding instructions on specific sequences and ICD categories may have the effect that a condition other than the starting point is selected as the underlying cause of death for use in statistics. Just a reminder, the goal of the work we do in mortality classification is to produce the most useful mortality statistics for epidemiology purposes and for informing public health decisions. Reading from Volume 2 of ICD-10 in Section 4.2.2, we learned that the starting point identified using steps SP1 to SP8 is considered the tentative underlying cause, or an abbreviation we use often, TUC. There may be special coding instructions on the tentative underlying cause or other reasons to modify it. Check whether the tentative underlying cause should be modified by applying the modification rules described in steps M1 to M4. In today's session, the application of step M2 and M3 will be presented, along with examples and explanations. All right, let's get into step M2. Again, reading from Volume 2, or the slide, we learn that if the tentative underlying cause describes a condition in general terms, and a term that provides more precise information about the site or nature of this condition is reported on the certificate, this more informative term is the new tentative underlying cause. Always check whether the new tentative underlying cause can be specified even further by other terms on the death certificate. That is, reapply step M2 until a tentative underlying cause that cannot be specified further has been selected. I'd like to emphasize that step M2 is only applied when there's another cause of death describing the site or nature of the tentative underlying cause more specifically. Let's look at example 8 from volume 2, section 4.2.2. On this example certificate, on line A, we have cerebral vascular accident reported as due to atherosclerosis with arterial embolism to brainstem recorded in part 2. The first step would be to apply an ICD-10 code number to each cause of death reported on the certificate. I selected I64 for line A, I70.9 for line B, and in part 2, I used I66.9. Applying selection step SP3, a tentative starting point of I709 is selected. That becomes our tentative underlying cause, and we're ready to consider whether that tentative underlying cause can or should be modified by anything else on this certificate. Step M1 applies to the tentative underlying cause I709 by a special instruction to prefer when reported with I64. Our new tentative underlying cause by an application of step M1 is I64. Applying step M2, the tentative underlying cause I64 is modified by the more specific description of the nature of this disease found in part 2. And in fact, the two codes combine into a third code, I63.5. There are no further modifications, so the underlying cause of death selected for statistical presentation is I63.5, cerebral infarction due to unspecified occlusion or stenosis of cerebral arteries. I635 is selected because it provides a more precise description of the site or nature of the tentative underlying cause, I64, stroke, not specified as hemorrhage or infarction. Although not necessarily a hard and fast rule, you may find that the tentative underlying cause of death may be modified by another more specific cause of death classified to the same block of codes. Likewise, a tentative underlying cause with a fourth character of .8 or .9 may be modified by a more specific cause of death classified to the same 3-character code, but at a more specific fourth character subcategory. On this slide, we have a detailed explanation of the coding and selection and modification of example 10. On this example, on line A is recorded meningitis due to on line B tuberculosis. Applying an ICD-10 code number to each cause of death reported, I selected G03.9 for line A and A16.9 for line B. An application of step SP3 selects a tentative starting point of A16.9, tuberculosis unspecified. An application of step M2 modifies the tentative underlying cause A169 by combining it with G039 and producing a combination code of A17.0, tuberculous meningitis. Checking for further modifications, none are found, so A17.0, tuberculous meningitis, is selected as the underlying cause of death for statistical presentation because it provides a more precise description of the site or nature of the tentative underlying cause, A16.9, tuberculosis unspecified. On this slide, we can read a little bit more about applying step M2 from ICD-10, Volume 2, Section 4.2.2. The more specific description must refer to the same condition as the tentative underlying cause. Do not disregard a generalized condition such as atherosclerosis because a more specific but unrelated condition is reported on the certificate. If several other expressions on the certificate provide more precise information on the tentative underlying cause, start with the first mentioned of these conditions. There are two important points on this slide. First, step M2 is restricted to more specific descriptions of the same condition. Generalized conditions are not discarded in favor of a more specific but unrelated condition. And second, if the tentative underlying cause can be modified by two more precise conditions reported on the certificate, choose the first mentioned of these more precise conditions. If you've already seen the video on applying step M1, you may recall a similar approach to resolving a situation when there's more than one valid modification to consider. One more instruction from Volume 2, Section 4.2.2, concerning step M2. Some instructions on specificity only apply under specific circumstances. For example, where a condition A is reported as a cause of condition B. Much like some applications of step M1, some instructions on specificity for M2 only apply when the tentative underlying cause has been reported as a cause of the more precise description or cause of death. This slide is for those of you who are IRIS users or users of the IRIS decision tables in a manual context. The specificity modifications are included in the decision tables. Actually, IRIS decision tables are an exceptionally useful aid to the correct application of step M2. The snippet on the slide shows that tentative underlying cause E149, diabetes unspecified, is modified by the more precise types of diabetes included in the codes E10.0 to E14.9. Like the modifications precipitated by an application of step M1, there are two types of modification in the application of step M2. They're the with mention of modifications, meaning that the other condition may appear anywhere on the certificate. And there are the when reported as a cause of, meaning that the other condition must appear in the correct causal relationship or be otherwise indicated as being due to the tentative underlying cause. There are two types of with mention of specificity modifications. Preference, meaning that the code for the other condition is preferred over the code for the tentative underlying cause. And combination, meaning that the code for the other condition and the code for the tentative underlying cause combine into a third code. There's one type of when reported as the cause of specificity modification, and that is the combination, meaning that when the other condition is reported as due to the tentative underlying cause, the code for the other condition and the code for the tentative underlying cause combine into a third code. The abbreviations in blue on this slide are used in the IRIS decision tables. The information on this slide and the previous one is not actually specified in ICD-10 Volume 2, but it is important to understand if using the IRIS decision tables to augment the application of step M2. Let's read about step M3 together here. From section 4.2.2 of ICD-10 Volume 2, if the tentative underlying cause is not the same as the starting point selected using steps SP1 to SP8, go back to step SP6 and repeat steps SP6, M1, and M2 with the new tentative underlying cause. In other words, if the tentative underlying cause is modified and is not the same as the initially selected one, steps SP6, M1, and M2 must be rechecked for further modifications of the new tentative underlying cause. On this slide, you'll see a detailed explanation of example 11 from Volume 2, Step M3. On the certificate on line A is reported sepsis due to arterial disease on line B and arterial embolism of left leg, also reported on line B. And in part 2, colon cancer. Applying code numbers to each cause of death reported on the certificate, we would have A401.9 on line A. On line B, I77.9 and I74.2, and in part 2, C169. Applying step SP3, the tentative starting point is I77.9, selected from the first position on line B. Step M2 is applied to modify this tentative underlying cause I779 by preferring the more specific cause of death I74.2. The code numbers are representing arterial disease, I77.9, and a more specific description of the site or nature of that disease as arterial embolism of left leg, I74.2. That's why step M2 is applied to prefer I74.2. Now, step M3 is to recheck steps SP6, M1, and M2 for the new tentative underlying cause I74.2. The reason we're doing that is because the new tentative underlying cause is not the same as the tentative starting point or the first tentative underlying cause selected by step SP3. When we recheck steps SP6, M1, and M2, we find that I74.2, our new tentative underlying cause, has an obvious consequence relationship with C16.9 from part 2. So by an application of step SP6, we select a new tentative underlying cause of C169. Because we have another different tentative underlying cause, we would recheck steps SP6, M1, and M2, finding no further modifications, and the underlying cause of death selected for statistical purposes from this certificate will be C16.9 malignant neoplasm of stomach, unspecified. You may realize at this point that we've been selecting step M3 all along. Let's look at a previously explained example. Remember this slide from earlier in the presentation? It illustrated the coding and selection of underlying cause of death from example 8 in volume 2. As part of the selection and modification process, each new tentative underlying cause of death was checked for further modifications. The information highlighted in yellow was on the original version of the slide. This checking for further linkages and modifications is step M3, rechecking steps SP6, M1, and M2. Remember, in this example, I63.5, cerebral infarction due to unspecified occlusion or stenosis of cerebral arteries, is selected as the underlying cause of death for statistical presentation because it provides a more precise description of the site or nature of the tentative underlying cause I64. One last little note about step M3. When rechecking steps SP6, M1, and M2, step SP6 is not to be considered when the new tentative underlying cause was reported as due to a different condition on the certificate. Let's look at an example. On this slide is a detailed explanation of example 12 in volume 2 at section 4.2.2 concerning the application of step M3. This example is almost the same as example 11, which we just looked at. Applying step SP3, the tentative starting point was I70.9, which was modified by an application of step M2, giving a new and more specific tentative underlying cause of I74.2. Because the tentative underlying cause I74.2 is different from the initially selected one, I70.9, step M3 is applied to recheck steps SP6, M1, and M2. In this case, though, step SP6 is not checked because I74.2 is on this certificate reported due to another condition. This concludes this presentation on the application of ICD-10 mortality classification steps M2 and M3. I hope you found it helpful. Thanks for listening.